Hello, welcome back to this week's episode of BS with your hosts, Brian Khov and Samantha Gonzalez. And please recall that the title of our podcast, BS, is our initials, nothing else. Don't be weird about it.
And today we are diving into the Beatles, looking at the impact they had on society. We conducted an interview with Scott Sheridan, my old high school psychology teacher. He is a multifaceted individual who started out as a roadie for well-known musicians and later became an educator. This interview was conducted via email, so Brian and I would be reading his responses to our questions. Mr. Sheridan said, and I quote, "I never want to do another Zoom for the rest of my life," end quote. Talk about COVID trauma.
Wonderful. Love COVID, huh? Anyways, everybody knows the Beatles, a popular band from the 1960s that revolutionized the whole music industry. So, we're going to focus on their social impact and many of our listeners can relate to. And now, without further ado, let it begin.
Okay, the first question we asked him was, what was it like being a roadie? And his response was, as a roadie, specifically to the bands that came to Los Angeles and worked at the studio in which they rehearsed and then rented equipment from us, I was in charge of managing the equipment they had in the lockers at our studio. I was going to the venue and setting up everything from drums to pianos, organs, guitars, and hundreds of other instruments. I also ran the soundboard for the rehearsals and sometimes at the venue itself. Responsibilities also included other purchases for the band that we won't go into.
All right. Now, the next question we asked was, how did you begin that kind of work? And his response was, I was writing songs in college, and during a trip around the country in a van, was writing songs about everything I saw and every woman I met. I decided to get into the music business. I came home, bartended to get enough money so I could fly to Florida and attend recording engineering school. I came back to Hollywood, lived in my van on the streets until I landed a job at the studio.
And the third question we asked him was, when did you first hear about the Beatles? How old were you when you first started listening to the Beatles? His response was, I watched the very first television appearance of the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was the show that made or broke the band. I was 7 years old and at a house with 3 older daughters. They were screaming at the TV and I was mesmerized. I began my love for the Beatles and rock and roll at that very moment. And he points out the spelling of the Beatles, how it's not like the insects, because it was of the beat movement that was happening at the time.
I did not know about that. That's a cool little fact. Anyways, the next question was, what did you think about their music? And to which he says, their music was was like nothing I've ever heard. Up to that point, all I could listen to was my parents' music, like Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis. But the Beatles blew me away, and I started smuggling a small radio to bed with me each night to listen to KHJ, LA's hip music station.
I wonder how his parents felt about the Beatles.
Me too. We should interview them next.
The next question we asked was, were there any trends that the Beatles started that you followed? His response was, one of the biggest trends they started besides the music itself was their clothing, haircut, and boots. All the hip kids in middle school wore Beatle boots, cut their hair like them, and wore clothes like them.
All right. So, following up with another question, we have, how many friends/family members did you have who also listened to the Beatles with you? And he says, most of my friends were late to catch up with the music scene, and parents started to come around with some of their softer hits like Michelle and I Love Her and others that were tolerable to the older generation. The Beatles were the first to cross the generations.
And that's pretty impressive.
Very.
Our next question was, do you think this impact was deserved? Why do you think they had such an impact on society? His response was, why such an impact? A phenomenon like this will never happen again, I believe. First, it was Sinatra, then Elvis, but nothing like what they accomplished. They were all cute, all extremely talented, and worked as one perfect unit for a while until it came crashing down. But that's a related question. Never before did a band have to stop touring because they couldn't be heard over the screaming. Girls were fainting at their sight, and worldwide fan clubs sprung up everywhere.
All right. We now then asked him, who do you think is the best Beatle? So his response was, who was the best? Obviously, John or Paul. They were both equal in writing their songs and their composing abilities. John sang and wrote the harder edge songs, while Paul wrote and sang most of the ballads. There was no real way to choose except for individual preference. Great response.
Next question. In your opinion, why did the Beatles break up? His response was, breakups are complicated. They were tired of each other by this time. John and Paul were arguing over which songs to release. Ringo and George were getting just one song an album, even though both had some magnificent
There you go.
songs of their own. Paul wanted his wife's father to handle the finances, and the others didn't. And then there was Yoko. John was inviting her to closed sessions that no one else was ever invited to, and she started giving her input, which none of the others wanted to hear. It all just became too much, and they all wanted to work on solo projects, which were all highly successful.
All right. And now for our final question. Do you think constant drug use played a part in some of their nonsensical lyrics? And he replies with, it was Bob Dylan that turned them on to drugs, and it was a landslide from there. They experimented with a plethora of different substances, and that changed their music dramatically. From I Want to Hold Your Hand to Bang Bang, Maxwell's Silver Hammer came down upon her head. And experimentation they were doing in the studio with different sounds has influenced every band that came along, even to this day. And their nonsensical lyrics, the best ever. Immerse yourself in Lucy in the Sky or I Am the Walrus, and you will be transported to another place and time. So yeah, drugs being a part of genius, absolutely.
Thank you all for tuning in. Please join us next week where we will be talking about Blue Oyster Cult, the 1967 rock band that created their hit song, Don't Fear, The Reaper, a song featured in the SNL skit titled More Cowbell, and appeared in the 2005 television show Supernatural. Special thanks to Mr. Sheridan for being our special guest on this podcast and telling us how the Beatles impacted his life.
Thank you all again.
Bye.